Thanks for sending over the personal statement. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Yeah, I was like, oh, well, I hope it's not too long.
Well, that's a separate issue entirely. Just the content's good. So we have good raw material to work with here. The question is, how can we distill it? Word count is part of that, and focus in on the key core message, the key story you want to communicate here. And that isn't just your life story. That isn't just the story of you or necessarily the story of why you want to go to law school. It's the story, a specific moment in time that illustrates everything, because you can't tell the A to Z. You've got to pick one portion of your life, one story, one anecdote, one experience that's representative. And so if you think of one story that could be, what comes to mind?
Ooh, that's tough. It's kind of trying to narrow down like everything.
Yeah, it's hard.
I wish I would have brainstormed a couple ideas.
Well, you've got a few here already. In this personal statement draft, you have several. So if you could take a moment to read it over if you'd like, but I'm wondering, what's the key thing that comes to mind where you think, I want them to know this?
Well, I think with that, I kind of, I was going back and forth as I was writing this, because part of it too is I don't know where I should be focused that makes my point come across. And in the sense, I'm thinking out loud, sorry.
That's fine.
Thinking more of, is it relevant to really even discuss like my background as an immigrant? Or should I really be focused more on, let's say, maybe in the workplace, right? And I could add a couple of points of saying, look, why I care so much about being kind of that person that influences and changes the conversation is because I've seen this, that, and somehow tie it back to, and this is a little bit about my background, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. And you also don't have to focus on one thing specifically, period. Like you could have one focus for the personal statement, another focus for a diversity statement. So if you want to talk about your background as an immigrant, you can save that for the diversity statement, and that frees you up to do something else for the main personal statement.
Okay. I think that makes a little more sense for me.
You could also flip it.
I'm like, how am I going to squeeze all of this in like 2 pages?
Yeah, you don't have to. You don't have to. The personal statement ideally is often 2 pages, double space. Lengths can vary, but you could save the story of an immigrant background for a diversity statement. And then you, like I said, you use something else for the main personal statement, or maybe you have 2 things that could be diversity statement topics and you choose one for the main statement, the other for the diversity. You have a lot of freedom. You have a lot of flexibility. Some schools even let you do a 3rd essay or in anything else you want to tell us. And of course, that's meant to be something compelling. You don't want to just throw something in for the sake of throwing it in. But if you have something that you think is worthwhile to share, that's important to share, then you have the freedom to do that.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out like how am I going to disperse it out, because I feel like I could hit different points right in life from, seeing people and trying to get resources for them more in the workspace than my own personal stories, which are very different too. And I think that was the same challenge too, right? Submitting a video for your scholarship. It was like, how do I get this under 5 minutes?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. It's hard to try and do everything. And so the only way to win that game is to not play that game and instead say, I'm not going to try and cover everything for a law school personal statement. You can cover a key specific thing, diversity statement, something else. And then the resume, you trust they'll see everything else there.
While you mentioned the resume on a tangent, I was a bit curious. I've heard a couple people say that, if you have something additional to tell the admissions committee, you should put that in an addendum. Particularly because I've noticed that they don't really look at much of like any graduate degree that you've done, like any GPA in that realm. I think it's something like nice to have, but obviously I'm considered a non-traditional student now because I've been out of school for like more than 10 years.
Right. Yeah.
So is it suggested to mention it somewhere along the lines of either statement, personal statement or diversity statement? Or
I wouldn't necessarily feel an obligation to, because they'll have your transcripts. they'll have your resume. They'll be able to see that you have a graduate degree. They'll be able to see the GPA associated with that degree, but that's not factored in for LSAC's calculated GPA. So whatever the number is, even if it's a 4.3, it's not going to have that much of an impact to boost your odds overall, because the numbers that count to them are the numbers that go to the ABA, that go to the US News rankings. And so that's kind of what impacts everything, unfortunately. So for better or worse. So what I would suggest is focus on your story. And if there's something that warrants an addendum, you could certainly write that, but it would typically be something that's a little bit more atypical than simply having a graduate degree GPA that's higher than your undergrad.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because I feel like I've been out of the academic world for a little bit. So it's kind of like, okay, well, yeah, I have work experience, but let's revert back. Like, let me go back to my academics. And it tends to be a little bit difficult as you've been away out of school for a while.
Sure, of course.
So
yeah, but admission officers, they'll often say write an addendum, simply because that kind of gets them off the phone, and then it lets you feel the freedom to explain yourself rather than doing it live on the phone with them. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter that much, and students tend to stress about it a lot in cases like that. So addenda can be useful, but I wouldn't always say yes to writing one. But if you have enough things going on, it could be worthwhile. I mean, you definitely have the makings of both a personal statement and a diversity statement here. And so if you'd like, we could talk a little bit about what could go where.
Yeah, totally. It's nice to have another set of eyes that's a little more relevant and looks at these things more often.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to help. So we talked a little bit about the option to do a diversity statement on your background coming from an immigrant family, being an immigrant. Is that something you would be interested in doing?
I think so. I think that would be of value. And since, I think you've made it very clear of separating the stories, I think it would much be easier as well to follow. Because that was the challenge I was also seeing when I was reading the personal statement, was that I'm jumping from different topics. And I know you want to make it as smooth of a read as possible.
Yeah, exactly. So if you were to pick a separate main personal statement topic out of what you've shared in your draft here, what might that be?
I think as a separate personal statement, somewhere along the line of the interdisciplinary scope of somehow connecting my education with like my interest of helping people, if that makes sense. I think I went along the long route. I'm looking at my personal statement at the same time. I went the long route of like describing my undergrad. And then I touch upon a little bit of my conversations at work, right, in the casino industry.
Okay, so tell me more about those conversations specifically in the work context.
I think in work context, since I work in HR, I get a little bit more exposure of the sensitive issues that are happening on properties, anywhere from labor disputes because people feel unsafe in the workplace, to concerns about managers not understanding the workforce, because you've got a lot of line level employees who, most of them are actually immigrants. A good majority don't speak English, or it's not proficient enough. And then it's a challenge of working with management that doesn't also connect with them. And then you start to see things break down. I used to help them with applying for like emergency funding. They were going to get evicted or had other personal issues going on. You start to see leadership making certain decisions for them that I think with a different lens, you ask, why would you do this? And it's as simple as booking buses when it was election time and getting them to go out and vote. What communication were you sharing with these employees? Some of them are Spanish speakers. What type of relations are you having with a culinary union? They're big here in Las Vegas. Smaller things as, how are people even interacting one-on-one with the employees that are coming in to help? Sometimes it's that really subtle type of racism that exists sometimes in those settings, or it's a property president asking me like, are you a DACA student? It raises a couple of eyebrows because it's their lack of exposure. I think sometimes, and a little bit of the presumptions they already have. So I've kind of been that outlier of having to be kind of the translator, mediator in between, because I have that additional lens of I speak Spanish, I'm Hispanic, and I've been used in that sense to kind of translate things for people, because they also don't understand where is the employee coming from at times, because they're kind of really set in their lens, or hey, maybe we should look at these couple of organizations to include in our green fair. It can come down to even the smallest things on property, where they want to share the goals of like Green Advantage, which is being eco-friendly, right? Because we have a property goal, we need to meet it strategically for the company. But they're not thinking of maybe other types of nonprofits that affect the different types of populations across the company. I mean, even sometimes with internal disputes of employee relations, sometimes you kind of see how they're just speaking two different language on two different wavelengths.
Wow. And I let you speak everything there. I could have jumped in a couple of times because I think you got what you needed, or we got what we needed, but I wanted to let that run because you were getting even more great material right there. And given that we are recording this conversation for YouTube and the podcast and such, one of the benefits is that you can go back and rewatch all of this and transcribe it. And this could be your personal statement. Like what you're giving me here is gold. And none of this was in your draft. You just had one throwaway line about casino executives that didn't really have any color or detail to it. But this, to me, shows that you have real exposure to labor law. You might not be a labor attorney, but in your role in HR, you're coming across a lot of things that fall into perhaps a gray area, or maybe they cross the line sometimes in terms of violations, or maybe they're not technically violations, but maybe they should be. And somebody needs to be advocating for these workers. And I get the sense that you sense some injustices, and that might be part of your motivation for wanting to go to law school. And if you can show what you've been exposed to in a real world sense, that not that just you're vaguely motivated by a sense of justice due to outrages that you see in the current events in the news, like that's nice. And there are plenty of applicants like that who are justly motivated and have good reason to want to go to law school, but their reasons are not nearly as compelling as yours, because you have actual exposure, not just in the past couple of weeks since the national news has gotten this story in the headlines every day. It's about you've gotten exposure for who knows how long, weeks, months, years, potentially. And you've been on the ground 8 hours a day or more, maybe, getting exposed to what's going on. And so if you can talk about that with all your references to specifics, but also then maybe highlight one or two specifics in detail, this particular worker, what was going on for him? Where did they cross the line? Where did you want to do more, but you couldn't because your management, you're not one of the workers, if I'm correct on that. That's one possibility. Yeah. So I would be thinking about that. And that could take up your entire personal statement.
Okay.
How does all that strike you?
I like where this is going. Yeah. I guess my only, and I guess that would just come down to how I write it. But my only concern, I guess not so much, but how much is too much sharing for the admissions team? Because, at some point, I also don't want them to say, oh, she's just completely like narking on this company. I mean, I won't mention the company, but they'll see it on my resume, obviously. And I don't want to come across as also just, well, these are all the things I didn't approve of, because I want it to sound more constructive. This is why I'm passionate about doing this type of work, right? Being that type of advocate, being the person who's involved, discussing and kind of working towards having a better policies, perhaps even internally.
Sure. That's a reasonable concern. So I think you're right to be aware of that. And so a couple of things, obviously they will see on your resume where you work and all of that. I wouldn't necessarily feel the need to name that company in the personal statement specifically. You can anonymize or keep some of the details vague if you want, or maybe change them if they're insignificant in some way, just to truly anonymize and protect everybody involved. But I do think it's important to address some specifics so they can see the sort of stuff that's going on. And then you can also say that it's not about this one company. Maybe this is endemic to the entire industry. Maybe you've gone to conferences or you've spoken with others at other casinos where they've seen similar things going on, or maybe there's a lot of this going on in Nevada in general. So you could broaden it a little bit to make it clear that this isn't just like you want to get revenge on this one company. It's really about much larger issues going on that you've been made aware of due to your work, and you want to be part of the change. And you can obviously, of course, end on a positive note and on a high note in terms of the work that you're looking to do. But a lot of applicants run into the problem of simply making it far too vague, and they'll spend half of it talking about the goals for the future and the work they want to do, but they haven't actually done any of it yet. And many are idealistic before law school, but then once they have all the student loans, they change their career path afterwards. But if you have that work experience prior for X number of years, the larger X is, the more evidence you have of what that you actually want to do what you say you want to do.
I think you bring up a good point too, that I was concerned before writing the personal statement of, how much do I need to be speaking about future goals? So I think you brought up a great point that, I should really focus on a couple of examples of, today's world, right? In the workforce, what have I seen? And I don't know if you would suggest me mentioning something, maybe a goal or two. I don't want to sound too idealistic as well. I think I did that when I was younger. And I held off on applying to law school for a while.
Sure. Yeah, and I do think that if you can tie it specifically to what you've done already, that's more compelling, it's more believable, and we'll have more faith in the fact of in you actually doing that going forward. But you don't have to have a specific detailed plan of attack because things change. You haven't actually been to law school yet. And so you may be exposed to new things, or maybe some things you want to do aren't feasible due to the laws, but others are feasible. And then obviously changing the laws is a whole separate conversation. Easier said than done, of course. But if you can at least give them a general sense of directions you might want to take it in, that's fine. And you can also say that you want to learn more about how you would go about advocating for those in need.
Okay. I think that sounds like a really good game plan.
Awesome. So there you have it. I think this is the makings of a fantastic personal statement. And then you still have plenty of material yet you could cover in a diversity statement and so on. So I would say maybe the personal statement in your case could be focused on your work experience, and then the diversity statement could be focused on your background and more personal experience. And then depending on how that goes, maybe you have space for a third thing somewhere else.
Okay. All right. That gives me a good kind of set of a roadmap on how to write this, because it's, you're trying to explain, really, this is why you need to consider me for law school. And there's just so much to include, and yet such small space. Yeah. 2 pages.
Fantastic. Any other questions for today?
I think you gave me a pretty good plan to follow. I'm taking notes as well of kind of how to proceed with the personal statement, at least. I think the diversity statement, would you also suggest that I just stick to maybe like 2 broad points, 3 points?
It all depends on exactly what those points are and how you're going about it, to what extent they tie together. The more they tie together, the better. But also know there's always that trade-off of breadth versus depth. So consider that as well.
Okay. Is there, and I mean, this is me just coming up with the idea. Do you know of any resource, maybe online, or a forum maybe, of students kind of discussing maybe what they've submitted previously? Not that I'm not interested in copying anyone else, but more of a sense of kind of how they're phrasing their essays, or how they're, what topics are they looking at, discussing, what are they submitting?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. A couple of things. One is that you can always post in the LSAT Unplugged Facebook group and get support from others on the personal statement, diversity statement, and such. A lot of times folks will trade statements back and forth to review each other's and edit each other's and offer feedback. I've also put together a book of real personal statements that I'm happy to send you. And these aren't the most perfect statements, but they're real, and students applied with them. And they give you a sense of different ways people approach the question.
I think that would be helpful. Just kind of get a sense of what others have done before. I think for me, it's kind of looking at how they structured it. What points how did they, really use it and continue the story on. It's kind of more of looking at the example, right?
Awesome.
I'm very
Okay.
visual.
Sure.
So for me, it's kind of like, okay, that's how it looks. Got an idea.
Fantastic. Whatever works. So this was great. Before we sign off, what would you say is the biggest insight you got from our call today?
I think the biggest insight is one, well, having another person, right? That is, you're in the field of tutoring people. So kind of what to look for. I think that's the major point. But to that, it's really being able to take all of the mess that I wrote and kind of deciphering it out and saying, hey, look, this is the road plan. This is kind of how it should look like. And I think the key points that you've made of really sticking to the work example, kind of having me walk through it and kind of focusing on that for the personal statement, that's super helpful. Because I think I was really stuck on that. It's how do I edit this down when it's really two different things?
Great. Well, please keep in touch and let me know if you need anything moving forward.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.